The enormous iron gates slowly opened, revealing a mansion so large it almost looked unreal against the gray sky. Tall marble pillars guarded the entrance, and a long driveway curved through perfectly. Trimmed gardens that seemed too perfect to be natural. Everything about the house screamed wealth, power, and control. Yet inside those massive walls lived a silence, so heavy that even the wind seemed afraid to disturb it. Alejandro Valdez stepped out of his black car, adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit. To the outside world, he was the definition of success, a self-made millionaire who owned several technology companies across the country. Magazines wrote about him, television channels invited him for interviews, and investors chased him for business deals. But none of those people knew the truth about what waited for him inside the mansion. Alejandro walked through the tall wooden doors. The echo of his footsteps bounced off the marble floors. "Sir, welcome home," said Marta, the housekeeper, approaching carefully. Alejandro nodded briefly. "Where is he?" "In his room, sir." Alejandro walked upstairs slowly, his heart already heavy before he even reached the door. Inside the room, a small boy sat near the window in a wheelchair. His name was Mateo, 8 years old. Thin arms, fragile body, eyes that held a strange mixture of innocence and sadness far beyond his age. Mateo had been born with a severe neurological condition that affected his muscles and coordination. Doctors said he might never walk. Some even said he might never speak properly, but Alejandro didn't care about those predictions. To him, Mateo was everything. The boy turned slightly when he heard the door open. "Papa." Alejandro forced a smile and walked closer. "How was your day, Campion?" Mateo shrugged softly. "Same." Alejandro's chest tightened. Every day seemed the same for Mateo. The mansion that looked like paradise from outside had become a quiet prison for the boy, because Alejandro was almost never home. Business trips, meetings, investors, conferences. He told himself it was all for Mateo's future, but deep down he knew something was missing. Mateo needed more than money. He needed someone. Someone patient, someone kind, someone who would truly care. And that's why Alejandro had made a difficult decision. He was going to hire a full-time nanny. Not just any nanny, someone special. Someone who could bring life back into this silent house. But Alejandro had already interviewed 12 candidates. All of them had impressive resumes. All of them had experience. And yet something about them felt wrong, too cold, too professional, too distant. Until one afternoon when a young woman walked through the gates of the mansion. Her name was Sofia Morales. She wore simple clothes. Nothing expensive. Her shoes were slightly worn, but her eyes carried something that immediately caught Alejandro's attention. Warmth, real warmth, the kind that couldn't be faked. She stood nervously in the living room while Alejandro looked at her file. "You don't have much experience," Alejandro said calmly. Sofia nodded honestly. "That's true, sir. I worked at a rehabilitation center for children for 2 years, but not in private homes." Alejandro looked up. "Why do you want this job?" Sofia hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wasn't sure if he would believe it. "Because children like your son deserve someone who doesn't give up on them." Alejandro's expression changed slightly. It was the first sincere answer he had heard in weeks. Most candidates talked about salary, benefits, working hours. But Sofia had talked about Mateo. Without even meeting him yet, Alejandro closed the folder. "The job will be difficult," he warned. "My son requires constant attention." "I understand. There are moments when he becomes frustrated. Sometimes he refuses therapy." Sofia nodded again. "That's normal." Alejandro raised an eyebrow. "You sound very confident." Sofia smiled softly. "Children don't need perfection. They need patience." For the first time in many days, Alejandro felt something unfamiliar. Hope. After a long pause, he stood up. "Follow me." They walked upstairs together. When Sofia entered Mateo's room, she stopped for a moment. The boy looked at her with curiosity. New faces often made him nervous, but Sofia didn't rush. She didn't introduce herself like a professional caregiver. Instead, she slowly crouched until her eyes were level with his. "Hi, Mateo," she said gently. The boy blinked in surprise. "How do you know my name?" Sofia smiled. "Because someone told me there is a very brave boy living in this house." Mateo looked suspicious. "Who?" Sofia leaned closer and whispered dramatically. The garden birds. Matteo stared at her for a second. Then suddenly, he laughed. A real laugh. Loud, bright, alive. Alejandro froze in the doorway. He hadn't heard that sound in months. Matteo almost never laughed with strangers. But somehow, within 30 seconds, this young woman had done what professional therapists couldn't do. Alejandro's heart tightened in his chest. Something about this moment felt important. Very important. Sophia turned to Alejandro. "May I talk with him alone for a few minutes?" Alejandro nodded slowly. He stepped outside and closed the door. 10 minutes passed, then 20. From inside the room, Alejandro occasionally heard laughter. More laughter, and then something else. Music. Soft humming. Curious, Alejandro quietly opened the door a few centimeters. What he saw made him stop breathing. Sophia was sitting on the floor. Matteo's wheelchair had been moved closer. She was teaching him a simple rhythm by tapping lightly on the armrest. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. Matteo followed. His coordination wasn't perfect, but he tried. And every time he succeeded, Sophia celebrated like he had won an Olympic medal. "Yes, that was amazing!" Matteo's face glowed with pride. Alejandro felt something warm rise inside his chest. For years, doctors and specialists had treated Matteo like a fragile problem, but Sophia treated him like a child, a normal child, a capable child. After a while, Sophia noticed Alejandro at the door. She stood up quickly. "I'm sorry, I hope it's okay that You're hired." Sophia blinked. "What?" Alejandro repeated calmly. "You start tomorrow." Sophia looked stunned. "But you didn't even check my references." Alejandro looked at Matteo, who was still smiling. "I already saw everything I needed." That night, the mansion felt slightly different. Not louder, not brighter, but warmer. For the first time in a long time, Alejandro allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. But he had no idea that only a few days later, he would come home early from work, walk quietly through the hallway, hear something strange coming from Matteo's room. And when he opened the door, what he saw inside would completely paralyze his heart. Because the nanny he had trusted was hiding something he never expected.